Carl Gustav Jung is widely regarded as one of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, a pioneer whose exploration of the human psyche reshaped modern psychology. His theories on the unconscious mind, archetypes, and individuation remain central to the study of human behavior and depth psychology. Yet, beyond the academic and clinical framework of his work, there exists a lesser-known yet equally compelling facet of Jung's intellectual journey: his deep engagement with the paranormal. From an early age, Jung's life was steeped in mysterious occurrences. Growing up in a household where ghostly apparitions, premonitory dreams, and unexplained phenomena were not merely whispered superstitions, but accepted realities, he was introduced to a world that defied rational comprehension. Rather than dismissing these experiences as illusions or coincidences, he would later strive to reconcile them with his evolving theories on the nature of consciousness. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who rejected spiritualism outright in favor of strict materialism, Jung maintained an open yet critical stance on the supernatural. He neither blindly accepted paranormal claims, nor dismissed them outright. Instead, he sought to understand these experiences through a psychological lens, probing the possibility that they might hold symbolic or archetypal significance. At the same time, he acknowledged the limits of conventional science in explaining phenomena that seemingly operated outside the bounds of causality. Throughout his career, Jung encountered a multitude of inexplicable events, some occurring within his own family, others emerging from his clinical work with patients, and still more unfolding in his personal life. These experiences ranged from eerie synchronicities to documented instances of unexplained physical disturbances, phenomena that, to him, hinted at the existence of forces beyond mere chance. His concept of synchronicity, the idea that events could be meaningfully connected without a direct causal relationship, became one of his most controversial yet influential contributions to psychology. Jung's engagement with the mystical extended beyond mere intellectual curiosity. He delved into alchemy, explored the I Ching, engaged in seances, and examined the experiences of mediums, all in pursuit of understanding the deeper workings of the unconscious. His correspondence with figures like physicist Wolfgang Pauli revealed his belief that psychology and quantum mechanics might intersect in ways yet to be fully understood. To Jung, the psyche was not confined to the individual mind, but extended into a vast and interconnected reality, where the barriers between the mental and the material world were far more permeable than commonly assumed. This exploration will trace Jung's lifelong fascination with the supernatural, examining the formative experiences of his childhood, his rigorous yet unconventional investigations into psychic phenomena, and his theoretical attempts to bridge the divide between psychology and the unknown. Was Jung merely documenting the unconscious projections of the human mind, or did he believe in the existence of forces that transcended psychological explanation? By the end of this journey, we will have navigated Jung's enigmatic relationship with the paranormal, a path where science, mysticism, and psychology converge in a way that challenges the very foundations of what we understand as reality. From the very beginning, Jung's perception of reality was shaped by an environment where the supernatural was not merely speculative, but an everyday occurrence. Unlike most children who are introduced to the world through the rigid frameworks of material reality, Jung's formative years were steeped in inexplicable events, instances that defied logic, yet were accepted without question in his family. His mother, Emily Preiswerk, was known for her unsettling relationship with the unseen. At night, she would retreat into her own world, seemingly communing with presences that no one else could perceive. To Jung, she was a paradox, warm and nurturing by day, enigmatic and distant once the sun had set. She kept a diary solely dedicated to documenting the strange disturbances she witnessed, an eerie testament to the consistency of these experiences. Her father, Samuel Preiswerk, was equally immersed in the spiritual realm, convinced that unseen forces surrounded him at all times. Jung's maternal grandfather, Reverend Samuel Preiswerk, took this belief even further. Fluent in Hebrew, he maintained that the language was spoken in the afterlife, and devoted himself to weekly conversations with the spirit of his deceased first wife. In his study, an empty chair was always reserved for her, symbolizing his conviction that death did not sever the ties between the living and the departed. This behavior, though unsettling to outsiders, was simply part of the world Jung grew up in. Then there was Augusta Preiswerk, Jung's grandmother, whose experiences with the unknown took an even more dramatic turn. After a prolonged coma that lasted 36 hours, she awoke with what appeared to be an enhanced sensitivity to the supernatural. She would later report seeing apparitions, figures unknown to her in life, but whose existence she later confirmed through historical records. Her accounts went beyond vague visions or indistinct sensations. They were detailed encounters with entities that seemed to carry their own histories, independent of her mind. These familial experiences were not confined to ghostly whispers or fleeting shadows. They were tangible, leaving marks on both physical objects and the minds of those who witnessed them. Samuel Preiswerk, so disturbed by the presence of spirits while writing his sermons, insisted that his daughter sit behind him as he worked. Her presence, he believed, served as a buffer against unseen interferences. Jung's mother, in turn, experienced episodes so intense that they pushed her into isolation, retreating into her bedroom to confront whatever forces occupied her nights. Such an upbringing inevitably shaped Jung's worldview. Where another child might have dismissed such experiences as figments of the imagination, he internalized them as part of a broader mystery, one that demanded explanation rather than denial. Unlike his father, who adhered to a more conventional, predictable existence, Jung found himself drawn to the unknown, sensing that the mind harbored dimensions that could not be explained through reason alone. One of the most haunting memories from his childhood involved a luminous floating head, an apparition that seemed to generate copies of itself, detaching from its original form and continuing in an endless sequence. It was an experience that defied all logic, yet to Jung, it was no more absurd than the stories he had grown up hearing. The line between hallucination and vision, subconscious projection and external entity, was already blurred in his mind. Even as a boy, Jung sensed that these experiences were not confined to his family, but were part of a larger human mystery. There was something universal about the way the unseen world revealed itself, something that transcended culture, history, and personal belief. The idea that reality could extend beyond the physical realm took root early, forming the foundation for what would later become one of the most daring psychological theories of the modern era. Far from treating these supernatural events as isolated anomalies, Jung would go on to explore them as reflections of the human psyche. He did not seek to debunk or to endorse, but to understand. And that, perhaps, is what sets him apart. Not a blind belief in the mystical, but an unrelenting pursuit of knowledge that refused to be constrained by the limits of conventional science. Jung's exposure to the supernatural was not limited to stories passed down through his family. It extended into his own direct encounters with inexplicable forces. Unlike many who dismissed childhood visions as mere imagination, Jung remained acutely aware that certain experiences defied logical explanation. The paranormal was not an abstract concept to him, but a recurring reality that demanded his attention. One of the earliest and most unsettling events he recorded occurred during his childhood, a vision that would linger in his memory for decades. He described witnessing a faintly glowing head, severed from its body, floating in midair. More disturbingly, the head did not remain singular. It replicated itself, detaching and forming a sequence, each one drifting forward like a spectral procession. Whether a projection of his subconscious or an external phenomenon, the experience left a lasting impression, reinforcing his belief that reality was far more complex than conventional wisdom suggested. Years later, as a young man studying at home in 1898, Jung encountered something even more perplexing. Without warning, a sharp, deafening crack reverberated through the room. Upon investigation, he discovered that an ancient walnut table, which had been in his family for generations, had split down the middle as if struck by an invisible force. There was no apparent reason for the rupture. No shifts in temperature, no external pressure. just an inexplicable fracture that had occurred in absolute silence until the very moment it had given way. 2 weeks after this event, another equally bizarre occurrence took place. This time, it was not a heavy wooden structure but something much smaller, yet just as inexplicable. From within a cupboard, a bread knife, which had been used just an hour before, lay shattered into 4 distinct pieces. Unlike the table, this object had been entirely undisturbed, yet it had inexplicably broken apart. Jung kept these remnants as tangible proof of forces beyond conventional understanding, and to this day, they remain in the possession of his family, a silent reminder of the mysterious forces that had once manifested in his presence. However, Jung's engagement with the paranormal did not stop at passive observation. He sought to understand these occurrences by immersing himself in experiments with mediumship. Though he approached the subject with the mind of a scientist, his personal experiences blurred the line between empirical observation and active participation. Among the most significant figures in these experiments was his cousin, Helen Preiswerk, who claimed to possess the ability to communicate with spirits. During seances conducted in his own home, Helen appeared to enter altered states in which she became a conduit for disembodied voices. What fascinated Jung most was not merely the content of the messages, but the transformation Helen underwent. In these states, she manifested entirely different personalities, individuals who spoke with distinct mannerisms, temperaments, and knowledge that seemed beyond her own. Some of these voices claimed to be Jung's own ancestors, further deepening his conviction that the past was not as distant as it seemed. Jung did not merely observe these occurrences as a detached scientist. He was deeply affected by them. At times, his own emotions seemed to intertwine with the manifestations, raising the question of whether these forces were external, or if they emerged from the depths of the psyche itself. It was a question that would haunt him for years. Were spirits independent entities, or were they projections of the unconscious mind, brought to life through the sheer power of belief? His mother's enigmatic presence continued to shape his understanding of this mystery. On one particular occasion, while visiting him at his office, she gazed upon the intricate graphs that covered his walls. Curious, she asked about his research. Jung explained the significance of the data, outlining his experiments. Then, in a tone he rarely heard from her, she asked a simple but profound question. "Do you think it could be something?" It was not merely the words that unsettled him, but the way in which they were spoken. There was a depth to her voice, an uncanny certainty, as though she had glimpsed something beyond what was visible. Her question burrowed into Jung's mind with such force that he found himself unable to continue his work for weeks. It was as if she had vocalized a hidden doubt within him, forcing him to confront the fragility of his own understanding. These experiences left Jung in a perpetual state of contemplation. He recognized that the mind was capable of astonishing feats, of creating realities so vivid that they seemed external. But he also understood that there were moments when external reality appeared to intrude upon the psyche, leaving behind traces that could not be ignored. Was it possible that the unconscious mind held secrets that science had yet to uncover? Or was there truly an unseen world that occasionally brushed against the fabric of reality? The more Jung explored these questions, the more he realized that the answers lay not in rigid categories, but in the spaces between, where psychology met mysticism, where perception shaped reality, and where the boundary between the self and the unknown became indistinguishable. Jung's personal paranormal experiences were not mere curiosities. They became the foundation upon which his later theories were built. These events were not external anomalies to be dismissed. They were invitations to delve deeper into the human psyche, to confront the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface. His journey had only just begun, but already he understood that the world was not what it seemed. Jung's fascination with the supernatural was never a matter of blind belief. Unlike those who either fully embraced or outright dismissed the existence of paranormal phenomena, he occupied a unique intellectual position, one that sought to understand rather than merely categorize. His goal was not to prove or disprove the supernatural, but to uncover the psychological mechanisms behind such experiences. What was it about the human mind that generated visions, premonitions, and inexplicable synchronicities? More importantly, how did these manifestations relate to the unconscious? From early in his career, Jung suspected that the psyche held depths far beyond what traditional psychology accounted for. The mind, in his view, was not a monolithic entity but a landscape teeming with symbols, patterns, and forces that functioned independently of conscious awareness. He theorized that paranormal encounters were, in many cases, expressions of these deeper currents. They were not necessarily proof of external spirits, nor were they simple hallucinations. Rather, they were windows into the hidden architecture of the human psyche, glimpses of forces at play beyond the reach of logic. At the heart of Jung's exploration lay his distinction between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The former was unique to each individual, a repository of forgotten memories, suppressed desires, and unresolved emotions. The latter, however, was something entirely different. It was a vast, inherited structure, a shared psychological framework that transcended personal experience and linked humanity through symbols and archetypes. Paranormal experiences, he believed, were often rooted in this collective domain. Take, for instance, the phenomenon of ghosts and apparitions. While conventional explanations often reduce such sightings to mere illusions, Jung approached the subject with a more nuanced perspective. He observed that descriptions of spirits across cultures bore striking similarities. Whether in ancient civilizations or modern accounts, spirits were often seen as shadowy figures, spectral presences, or even luminous beings, forms that corresponded with age-old archetypes of the soul and the afterlife. Were these manifestations genuine supernatural entities, or were they projections of the unconscious mind, shaped by the archetypal imagery embedded in the human psyche? Jung extended this idea further, suggesting that many experiences attributed to spirits might instead be autonomous psychic projections, fragments of the unconscious taking on an externalized form. This could explain the uncanny sensation of presence in supposedly haunted spaces. The mind, particularly in altered emotional states, might unconsciously externalize its fears, unresolved traumas, or ancestral memories, creating a perceived entity where none existed. His exploration of seances and mediumship provided additional insight. He noted that mediums often entered trance states where they would speak in voices unrecognizable as their own, assume identities from the distant past, or even claim to channel historical figures. Rather than dismissing these occurrences as fabrications, Jung viewed them as potential evidence of complexes, autonomous psychic structures that could temporarily take control of an individual's personality. These complexes, residing in the unconscious, could be so powerful that they manifested externally, convincing both the medium and the observers of their independent existence. Jung himself had witnessed his cousin Helen Preiswerk assume entirely different personas during seances. At times, she spoke fluently in languages she had never studied. At others, she conveyed obscure historical details she could not have known. Rather than attributing these phenomena solely to supernatural forces, Jung explored the possibility that her unconscious mind was tapping into something beyond individual experience, perhaps even the ancestral memory encoded within the collective unconscious. His theory of archetypes further refined this perspective. Archetypes, according to Jung, were primordial images and themes that recurred across myths, religions, and dreams. They were not mere abstractions, but fundamental psychological structures that shaped human perception. The figure of the wise old man, for instance, appeared in myths as the sage, the prophet, or the mentor. The shadow emerged in folklore as demons, ghosts, or ominous entities lurking at the periphery of awareness. Paranormal experiences, he believed, could be moments when these archetypes broke through into conscious reality, manifesting in a form that felt external but was, in essence, a projection of the deeper self. A prime example of this theory in action was Jung's own visionary encounter with Philemon, an entity that appeared to him repeatedly during a period of deep introspection. Philemon was no mere dream figure. He was a distinct presence with his own wisdom, thoughts, and personality. Jung engaged in conversations with him, treating him not as an imaginary construct, but as an independent intelligence within his own mind. This experience led Jung to conclude that certain inner figures possessed a life of their own, operating independently of the ego's control. If this was possible within the individual psyche, what did it imply about spirits and supernatural beings? Were they truly external, or were they manifestations of the same deep forces that had produced Philemon? Jung also considered the psychological conditions under which paranormal phenomena were most likely to occur. He noted that visions, hauntings, and synchronistic events were often reported during times of heightened emotional tension, grief, trauma, or existential crisis. It was as if the unconscious mind, in its attempt to process these intense emotions, produced symbols and events that took on an autonomous reality. Dreams of deceased loved ones, prophetic insights in moments of despair, objects inexplicably moving. Such occurrences, rather than being random, might be the psyche's attempt to bridge the conscious and unconscious realms. This idea extended to his analysis of poltergeist activity. Unlike traditional supernatural interpretations that ascribed such disturbances to mischievous spirits, Jung suspected they were externalized psychic conflicts. In cases where objects moved, electrical anomalies occurred, or strange noises filled a space, the true source might be repressed psychological energy seeking an outlet. This concept aligned with his broader understanding of the psyche's power to materialize internal conflicts in the external world, a phenomenon he would later explore in depth through his work on synchronicity. At no point did Jung claim to have definitive answers. He acknowledged that the question of spirits, visions, and supernatural forces was too vast for a singular interpretation. However, he remained steadfast in his conviction that the human mind was capable of far more than conventional science acknowledged. To dismiss paranormal phenomena outright was to ignore the vast, uncharted dimensions of the psyche. His investigations into these mysteries were not about affirming belief or disproving skepticism. They were about expanding the framework through which reality was understood. Whether these forces were psychological, supernatural, or a synthesis of both, one truth remained clear. The unseen world was not separate from us. It was deeply intertwined with our own inner landscape, shaping our experiences in ways that were both profound and elusive. Jung's intellectual curiosity led him beyond conventional psychological paradigms and into the depths of meaningful coincidences, events that appeared connected, yet lacked a discernible cause and effect relationship. It was through this inquiry that he formulated one of his most influential and controversial concepts: synchronicity. Unlike mere chance, synchronicity suggested that two or more occurrences, while not causally linked, were nonetheless tied together by a profound, often symbolic meaning. The seeds of this idea were planted through years of observation, both in his own life and in the experiences of his patients. He noted that moments of psychological significance often coincided with external occurrences that mirrored an internal state. For instance, an individual undergoing a personal crisis might suddenly encounter an event, an unexpected encounter, a symbolic image, an unusual object that perfectly reflected the emotional or spiritual turmoil they were facing. These were not simple coincidences, but rather indications of an underlying pattern in reality. Jung's exploration of the I Ching, the ancient Chinese divination system, deeply influenced his perspective. He was fascinated by the Eastern worldview, which did not rely on the rigid framework of causality that dominated Western thought. Instead, the Chinese approach suggested that events were governed by patterns and interconnected flows of meaning, rather than by linear chains of cause and effect. The I Ching, a text dating back thousands of years, functioned on this principle. Rather than predicting the future through mechanistic logic, it provided answers based on the resonance between a question and the moment in which it was asked. For Jung, this aligned with what he had long suspected. There were forces at play in the universe that did not adhere to classical Newtonian mechanics. While science sought to explain events through determinism and probability, there existed another mode of understanding reality, one that recognized the deep psychological and symbolic currents that shaped human experience. One of Jung's most famous examples of synchronicity occurred during a therapy session with a woman who was highly resistant to psychological change. She recounted a dream in which she was given a golden scarab, a symbol of rebirth in Egyptian mythology. At that very moment, a tapping sound came from the window. Jung turned to see a live scarab beetle, an insect not commonly found in the region, attempting to enter the room. He caught it and handed it to her, saying, "Here is your scarab." This event was transformative. It shattered her rigid rationalism and allowed her to engage with her unconscious on a deeper level. Jung argued that such moments were not mere accidents, nor could they be explained away by chance alone. Instead, they were expressions of the psyche's deep entanglement with the external world. It was as if the mind, in its most intense moments, could summon corresponding symbols from the environment, events that held no causal relationship, but carried immense psychological and spiritual significance. His encounters with Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, further strengthened his conviction that synchronicity was not merely a psychological phenomenon, but a principle embedded in the very fabric of reality. Pauli, one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics, had observed peculiar anomalies in his field, events that suggested that the observer and the observed were not separate. This dovetailed with Jung's belief that the mind and matter were not entirely distinct entities, but two aspects of a unified whole. Together, Jung and Pauli explored the possibility that synchronicity might be a fundamental principle akin to causality, yet operating in a way that defied classical physics. If the universe was structured not just by cause and effect, but also by meaningful connections across time and space, then human consciousness might be intimately woven into the underlying patterns of existence. Jung did not propose that synchronicity operated in a supernatural way. Rather, he suggested that the unconscious might have access to a level of reality that the conscious mind could not perceive. When a synchronistic event occurred, it was as if the deeper layers of the psyche were momentarily aligning with the external world, revealing a connection that was ordinarily hidden. A particularly haunting example of this emerged in Jung's own life. Shortly before the outbreak of World War I, he began experiencing a series of apocalyptic visions. He saw Europe drowning in rivers of blood, cities engulfed in flames, and countless people suffering under immense destruction. At the time, he did not know what to make of these visions. Were they personal, symbolic nightmares or something more? When the war erupted in 1914, he realized that these visions had not been random. They were premonitions, synchronistic glimpses into a reality that had yet to unfold. This raised a question that deeply troubled Jung. How could an event that had not yet happened be perceived in advance? The principle of causality dictated that the future could not affect the present. Yet, if synchronicity was real, then time itself was not as rigid as it seemed. Jung explored this paradox further in his later years, suggesting that the psyche might operate outside the conventional constraints of linear time. In his view, the unconscious did not merely function in the present. It had a connection to deeper layers of reality where past, present, and future were intertwined. This was reflected in precognitive dreams, sudden intuitive insights, and moments where reality seemed to mirror one's internal state with eerie precision. Critics of Jung's theory argued that synchronicity was merely an illusion, a result of pattern-seeking tendencies within the human mind. According to skeptics, people experienced these events and assigned meaning retroactively, selectively remembering coincidences that seemed significant, while ignoring the vast number of meaningless occurrences that happened every day. Jung, however, countered this argument by emphasizing that true synchronistic events were not just coincidences, but carried a deep psychological charge. They were experienced in moments of emotional intensity, often occurring in crucial turning points in a person's life. More importantly, they were not merely subjective interpretations, but real occurrences that defied statistical probability. He also noted that synchronicity was not confined to individual experiences. There were collective synchronistic events, moments in history where entire societies seemed to undergo symbolic transformations. Mass movements, revolutions, cultural renaissances, these too seemed to emerge not through straightforward causality, but through deeper, unseen forces shaping collective consciousness. Ultimately, Jung saw synchronicity as a bridge between psychology and the nature of reality itself. It suggested that the psyche was not an isolated entity, locked within the brain, but a force intimately connected to the patterns of existence. The implications were profound. If meaning could manifest in the external world without a direct cause, then perhaps consciousness itself was woven into the very structure of the universe. His lifelong investigation into this phenomenon remained unresolved. Jung never claimed to fully understand the mechanics of synchronicity, nor did he offer a final explanation. Instead, he treated it as a mystery to be explored rather than a problem to be solved. He urged future thinkers to move beyond the rigid dichotomy of science and mysticism, embracing the idea that meaning itself might be a fundamental principle of nature. As he once wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." Despite his unwavering fascination with the paranormal, Jung remained, at his core, a scientist. His empirical mindset demanded that he approach extraordinary phenomena with a rigorous analytical lens, rather than surrendering to blind belief. This dual perspective, one foot in the mystical and the other in the scientific, made him a divisive figure. To his detractors, his openness to the supernatural made him too mystical. To the more spiritually inclined, his insistence on psychological explanations rendered him too skeptical. Jung never accepted paranormal claims at face value. He distinguished between genuine phenomena and elaborate fabrications, well aware that the field of spiritualism was rife with fraud. In his investigations of mediums and seances, he documented instances where he suspected deliberate trickery, emphasizing the necessity of controlled conditions and unbiased observation. This skeptical streak placed him at odds with many in the scientific establishment. Mainstream psychology, rooted in materialist and mechanistic principles, dismissed the paranormal as a relic of pre-modern superstition. The rise of behaviorism, spearheaded by figures like John Watson and later B.F. Skinner, further solidified the notion that all human behavior could be reduced to observable stimulus-response patterns. The unconscious mind itself was controversial enough. Claims of clairvoyance, telepathy, and psychokinesis were deemed outright pseudoscience. Jung's relationship with Sigmund Freud was particularly strained over this issue. Initially, Freud had positioned himself as an advocate of a rational, scientific psychoanalysis, fiercely opposing any notions that strayed into the mystical. He saw the rising tide of occultism as a threat to the credibility of psychoanalysis, fearing that their field would be relegated to the same status as alchemy or astrology. This divergence became evident in a famous incident between Jung and Freud in 1909. During an intense discussion on the validity of the paranormal, Jung felt a strange, mounting pressure in his chest, as if an unseen force was compressing his diaphragm. Just as he was about to speak, a sudden loud crack emanated from a bookcase in Freud's office. Freud dismissed it as nonsense, attributing it to pure coincidence. Jung, however, remained unconvinced. He predicted that the noise would happen again, and as soon as he said this, another loud crack reverberated through the room. Freud's response was one of silent disbelief, yet he refused to entertain the possibility of anything beyond conventional explanation. For Jung, however, this moment reinforced his conviction that the mind could interact with the external world in ways that defied classical causality. It was an early confrontation between their differing worldviews, one seeking refuge in strict rationalism, the other daring to explore the irrational, the unknown, and the transcendent. Although Freud remained skeptical of Jung's forays into the paranormal, his own views evolved with time. In a private letter, he later confessed, "In matters of occultism, I have grown humble. My hubris has been shattered." This reluctant admission revealed a shift in Freud's thinking, though he remained hesitant to publicly embrace ideas that could undermine the credibility of psychoanalysis. Jung, on the other hand, saw no contradiction between scientific inquiry and the study of anomalous phenomena. He believed that just as modern physics had revolutionized our understanding of space and time, psychology had the potential to redefine human perception and consciousness. Quantum mechanics, which had introduced radical ideas about probability, wave-particle duality, and observer effects, suggested that reality was far more mysterious than classical science had assumed. If physics had proven that matter could behave unpredictably at a fundamental level, was it truly irrational to consider that consciousness might operate under principles beyond conventional understanding? Jung found an unexpected ally in Wolfgang Pauli, one of the architects of quantum mechanics. Their collaborative discussions explored the possibility that psyche and matter were interconnected, that consciousness and the physical world were not entirely separate domains, but rather two facets of the same underlying reality. Pauli was deeply intrigued by Jung's theory of synchronicity, believing that it resonated with the non-causal nature of quantum events. Their exchange of ideas bridged the gap between psychology and theoretical physics, hinting at a deeper principle of interconnectedness that transcended both disciplines. Despite his empirical stance, Jung's work was often mischaracterized by his critics. His exploration of mythology, alchemy, and mysticism led some to dismiss him as a romantic thinker detached from scientific rigor. However, this assessment overlooked the depth of his methodology. He did not advocate blind faith in supernatural forces. Rather, he sought to understand why such beliefs persisted throughout human history. To him, these myths and symbols were not relics of ignorance, but psychological realities, expressions of the collective unconscious that shaped human experience across cultures. He also remained cautious in his treatment of spiritualistic claims. While he acknowledged the authenticity of certain paranormal events, he was careful to distinguish between subjective experiences and objective truths. His theory of complexes, for instance, suggested that many supposed ghostly visitations or spirit communications were not external phenomena, but rather projections of the unconscious mind. A person experiencing a poltergeist-like disturbance might, in reality, be externalizing inner psychic conflicts rather than interacting with a literal supernatural entity. That said, Jung did not dismiss the possibility of spirits altogether. In his later years, his stance became more nuanced. He entertained the idea that spirits could be autonomous psychic entities, neither wholly psychological nor entirely physical, but existing in a realm that defied easy classification. He once remarked, "I see no proof whatever of the existence of real spirits. Yet after 50 years of research, I no longer feel certain that they do not exist." His critics, particularly within mainstream psychology, remained unswayed. Figures like B.F. Skinner and Karl Popper dismissed his work as unfalsifiable, arguing that concepts such as archetypes, synchronicity, and the collective unconscious lacked empirical testability. They viewed Jung's methods as too interpretative, too speculative, making them incompatible with the rigorous demands of scientific psychology. However, Jung countered this by asserting that psychology itself was not a hard science in the way that physics or chemistry were. The human psyche could not be measured or quantified with the same precision as physical matter. Emotions, dreams, and symbols could not be distilled into pure data, yet they were undeniably real. His goal was not to provide mechanistic explanations, but rather to offer insight into the deeper layers of the mind. In a world increasingly dominated by scientific materialism, Jung feared that the soul was being neglected. He saw the modern rejection of the mystical and symbolic as a profound psychological imbalance, a severance from the ancient wisdom that had guided humanity for millennia. To him, the rational mind alone was insufficient to grasp the full scope of reality. There was an undeniable mystery at the heart of existence, and true psychological well-being required acknowledging both the seen and the unseen. Despite opposition from the scientific establishment, Jung's legacy endured. His theories influenced depth psychology, transpersonal studies, and even modern neuroscience, which has since begun to uncover the neural basis of unconscious processing. a concept he pioneered long before it was validated through brain imaging techniques. In the final years of his life, Jung remained reflective. He did not claim to have definitive answers, nor did he present his work as an absolute truth. Instead, he urged future generations to continue the quest, to remain open to possibilities that lay beyond the limits of current knowledge. He understood that the tension between science and the unknown was not a contradiction, but rather an essential dialectic, one that drove humanity's endless pursuit of understanding. In his own words, "I shall not commit the fashionable stupidity of regarding everything I cannot explain as a fraud." As Carl Jung approached the later decades of his life, his intellectual pursuits took on an even deeper philosophical and spiritual dimension. The empirical psychologist, who had once been cautious in publicly engaging with the mystical, became more outspoken about his experiences with the unconscious, dreams, and visionary states. This shift did not mark a departure from his scientific rigor, but rather an expansion of his psychological framework to accommodate the inexplicable, the symbolic, and the sacred. His famous confrontation with the unconscious, which began in the aftermath of his break with Freud, would come to define his most introspective period. This was not merely a phase of intellectual discovery, it was a profound existential ordeal. Jung found himself thrust into a world of visionary experiences, symbolic figures, and archetypal dialogues that defied rational explanation. Unlike traditional psychological inquiry, which dissects the mind from an external perspective, Jung became both the subject and the observer of these mystical encounters. One of the most striking figures to emerge from these visions was Philemon. This wise, otherworldly being, appearing with kingfisher wings and an aura of ancient knowledge, became a guide in Jung's inner journey. Unlike the abstract symbols of mythologies he had studied, Philemon possessed an autonomy that Jung could not easily attribute to his own psyche. In dialogues with this figure, Jung came to an unsettling yet transformative realization. Thoughts and images do not always originate from the conscious mind. Some emerge as though they belong to an intelligence beyond the self. This insight deepened his understanding of the unconscious, leading him to distinguish between the personal unconscious, formed by one's own experiences and repressed material, and the collective unconscious, a reservoir of inherited symbols and archetypes shared across humanity. The discovery of this vast, impersonal psychic domain further reinforced Jung's belief that the psyche was not bound by the limits of individual consciousness, but extended into a universal realm of symbolic meaning. Throughout this period, Jung documented his experiences in what would later become the Red Book, a manuscript filled with vivid illustrations, intricate mandalas, and esoteric reflections. At the time, he kept this work private, believing it was too personal and too radical for public reception. Decades later, when it was finally published, readers were astounded by its fusion of psychology, mysticism, and visionary art, revealing the depths of Jung's inner world and his exploration of the unknown. His engagement with these mystical experiences was not confined to solitary introspection. He continued to investigate paranormal phenomena, synchronistic events, and meaningful coincidences, convinced that these occurrences were not merely chance happenings, but expressions of an underlying order beyond conventional causality. His study of the I Ching, for example, was not just an academic pursuit, but a genuine method of accessing insights from the unconscious through symbols and causal connections. He memorized all 64 hexagrams and would consult them during critical moments of his life. But perhaps one of the most chilling experiences of Jung's later years was his repeated premonitions of global catastrophes. In the years leading up to World War I, Jung was tormented by visions of rivers of blood engulfing Europe, massive destruction, and widespread suffering. At first, he questioned whether these disturbing images were a reflection of his personal psyche or something more collective. When war broke out in 1914, he realized his visions had been precognitive, foretelling events far beyond his personal life. Similarly, near the end of his life, Jung had another ominous vision. This time, he saw vast portions of the world laid to waste, but not the entire planet. He described this as an apocalyptic event, yet not one of total annihilation. Though Jung never explicitly stated what he believed this vision foretold, some scholars speculate that it was a warning about future crises, perhaps the Cold War, environmental destruction, or even events yet to come. His daughter recorded this unpublished vision, ensuring that even in death, Jung's insights would continue to provoke deep contemplation about the fate of humanity. His connection to the unseen extended beyond visions of large-scale destruction. He also had personal encounters with death, including eerily timed synchronicities involving loved ones. On one occasion, while traveling by train, Jung was overwhelmed by the sensation of someone drowning. Upon arriving home, his grandchildren rushed to tell him that the youngest boy had nearly drowned at precisely the time Jung had felt the vision. In another instance, Jung dreamed of his wife's bed transforming into a deep stone pit, resembling a grave. He then saw a ghostly figure rise from it, dressed in white with mysterious black symbols on the gown. When he awoke at 3 a.m., he immediately checked on his wife, who was still alive. However, later that morning, news arrived that a cousin of his wife had died. At exactly 3 a.m. Such experiences reinforced Jung's belief that the psyche could transcend the limits of time and space, perceiving realities that lay beyond ordinary human awareness. This conviction was not merely theoretical. It was shaped by personal encounters with synchronicity, premonitions, and phenomena that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Despite his growing fascination with spiritual and esoteric matters, Jung remained critical of those who claimed to possess absolute knowledge of the afterlife. He did not assert definitive answers about the existence of spirits, the nature of God, or what happens after death. Instead, he insisted that these were mysteries too great for the human mind to fully grasp. While he acknowledged that some individuals seemed to have access to a deeper reality, he warned against the dangers of dogma, blind faith, and rigid belief systems that stifled true exploration. His thoughts on reincarnation reflected this cautious openness. While he did not fully embrace the doctrine, he entertained the idea that unresolved psychological processes might continue beyond death in some form. In a dream, he saw his deceased companion Tony Wolfe, reborn as a farmer in the Umbrian countryside, a stark contrast to the intellectual persona she had cultivated in life. To Jung, this dream symbolized an unfinished aspect of her psyche, finding expression in a new form. Meanwhile, his visions of his late wife Emma were markedly different. Rather than appearing as a figure still connected to earthly concerns, she seemed distant, engaged in higher spiritual pursuits related to her studies of the Holy Grail. This contrast left Jung with a sense that each individual's post-mortem experience might differ, depending on their psychological and spiritual development in life. Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead, a cryptic text he wrote under the pseudonym Basilides, emerged from one of the most surreal events of his life. One evening, his home was overwhelmed by an ominous presence, a sensation of being surrounded by countless unseen entities. His young daughter, inheriting the clairvoyance of her grandmother, claimed she could see the spirits. Then, suddenly, Jung heard a chorus of voices declare, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought." In a feverish trance, Jung wrote for 3 days, transcribing a message that seemed to come from beyond him. The result was a mystical dialogue exploring the nature of existence, opposites, and transcendence, a text that some scholars view as a precursor to his later theories on individuation and the self. By the time Jung reached the final years of his life, he had become a man who stood between worlds, not fully a scientist nor entirely a mystic, but something in between. His reflections on death, consciousness, and the unknown continued until the very end. When asked whether he believed in God, he famously replied, "I don't need to believe, I know." Carl Jung's relationship with the paranormal was neither blind faith nor outright rejection. His perspective on the mystical was uniquely balanced, both analytical and experiential, critical yet open-minded. Unlike those who dismissed the paranormal as mere superstition, and unlike those who accepted it without question, Jung sought to understand, interpret, and integrate these experiences into a coherent psychological framework. His work remains one of the most nuanced attempts to bridge the gap between the scientific and the mystical, between psychology and spirituality. What set Jung apart from both scientific skeptics and esoteric enthusiasts was his insistence on personal experience as the foundation for knowledge. His intellectual journey was not simply an academic exercise, but a lifelong engagement with the depths of the human psyche, where he encountered visions, synchronicities, and forces that challenged conventional explanations. He did not regard these as isolated anomalies, but rather as manifestations of an underlying reality, one that extended beyond individual consciousness into the collective fabric of existence. Throughout his career, Jung maintained that paranormal experiences were deeply tied to the human psyche. He saw them not as random, supernatural occurrences, but as expressions of unconscious processes, reflections of archetypal forces that shape human thought, behavior, and perception. Ghosts, spirits, premonitions, synchronicities, whether literal or symbolic, served as reminders of the hidden structures governing reality. His concept of synchronicity remains one of the most compelling and widely discussed aspects of his work. By proposing that meaningful coincidences are not bound by conventional causality, Jung opened a door for modern psychology to engage with the mystery of causal connections. The idea that certain events could be linked not by cause and effect but by meaning itself continues to challenge our understanding of reality. His collaboration with physicist Wolfgang Pauli, as well as his studies of the I Ching, reinforced his belief that Western science had overlooked an entire dimension of reality, one recognized in Eastern traditions for millennia. Jung's legacy extends far beyond psychology. His work has influenced fields as diverse as philosophy, comparative religion, mythology, neuroscience, and even quantum physics. His exploration of the unconscious, archetypes, and individuation laid the foundation for modern depth psychology. But his fascination with dreams, mysticism, and the unexplained has also inspired spiritual seekers, artists, and thinkers across generations. Yet, despite his extensive studies, Jung never claimed to have all the answers. He acknowledged that the mysteries of the psyche and the cosmos exceeded human comprehension. He approached the paranormal with both reverence and scrutiny, knowing that certainty was an illusion. This humility set him apart from dogmatists on both ends of the spectrum, those who arrogantly dismissed the unknown, and those who blindly accepted it without question. Jung's ability to live with ambiguity, to embrace paradox, and to navigate between worlds of science and spirituality is what makes his work so enduring. He did not seek to impose a rigid doctrine, but rather to invite others to explore the vast inner landscape of the psyche. He believed that true knowledge could not be dictated from authority, but had to be discovered through direct experience. His final reflections on life, death, and the unseen reveal a man who had wrestled with profound questions and emerged with a deep, intuitive understanding. His vision of reality was not limited to the material, nor was it confined to the purely spiritual. It was an integration of both, a synthesis of mind and matter, consciousness and mystery. In the end, Jung left us not with definitive conclusions, but with an invitation to question, to reflect, and to experience the unknown for ourselves. As he once said, "Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience." We conclude this exploration of Carl Jung's mystical and psychological journey. We invite you to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever encountered a moment of synchronicity that felt too meaningful to be mere coincidence? Have dreams or intuitions ever revealed something beyond ordinary perception? Jung's work encourages us to remain open to the unknown, to recognize that the mind extends beyond what we can measure, categorize, or fully explain. If his journey teaches us anything, it is that the mystery of existence is not something to be solved, but something to be engaged with, questioned, and experienced. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced something beyond explanation? And if you found this video insightful, consider subscribing for more content on psychology, mysticism, and the depths of human consciousness. Until next time.